Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the frostbitten streets of Victorian England. But don't worry, we're not here for romance or the top hats. No, no. Tonight, we're taking a closer look at something even more brutal than the cold. The unsung heroines of the Victorian winter. The prostitutes of London. You know, the ones who had to navigate the dreary fog, unspeakable filth, and a winter that would freeze your heart just by looking at it. So before we get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below and tell me, when's the last time you had a winter that made you feel like you were living in a Dickens novel? Alright, now dim those lights, switch on a fan for that peaceful white noise, and get cozy because we're about to step into the shoes of these tough women of the past. But first, let's pause. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to live through a Victorian winter without the luxury of central heating or a hot cup of cocoa? How would you survive endless mud, unrelenting cold, and a world where the simplest comfort might kill you? What would life be like when your only coat was one that smelled faintly of regret? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in Victorian London. The year is 1855. You're standing on a dirty street corner, facing down an unforgiving winter. Welcome to survival mode. Good luck. You've just stepped out of your tiny, grimy room into the freezing streets of Victorian London. The cobblestones are slick with mud, and the fog is thick enough to swallow you whole. The smell of sewage and coal smoke fills your nostrils, and the sound of horses' hooves clattering against the ground is the only thing that keeps you from losing your mind. In the distance, a man in a top hat stumbles by, his collar turned up, like he's just escaped a particularly bad meeting with a chimney sweep. You've got a job to do, and no amount of bitter wind is going to stop you. But seriously, did people survive in these conditions? Were there even any decent boots in the Victorian era? As you shuffle down the street, it's hard not to notice the sheer absurdity of it all. The gas lamps flicker like they're doing their best impression of a candle with commitment issues. You wonder how anyone could possibly stay warm when the very air feels like it's made of frozen disappointment. The wind slices through you like a bitter ex-lover still trying to ruin your life, and all you can think about is how ridiculous it is that you're doing this for a living. Because yes, you're a prostitute in Victorian London, and the reality is that the streets are your office. But don't worry, it's not all bad. No, in fact, you've gotten used to the smell of the muck, the cold seeping into your bones, and the constant nagging feeling that you might just slip into the Thames and end up in a place you'd rather not think about. What you haven't gotten used to is the constant slipping. Your boots, much like the rest of your life, could seem to be doing their best to fail you. You try to step carefully over the puddles of freezing muck, but there's always a moment when your foot decides to betray you, sending you into a very undignified wobble. At least you're not alone. Everyone in this city has a similar struggle, though. You can't help but wonder if maybe you'd have a bit more dignity in life if you could afford boots that weren't falling apart. You take comfort in knowing you're not the only one trying to survive these conditions, but honestly, does anyone ever look good in these streets? The coal dust hanging in the air makes every breath feel like you're trying to inhale a chunk of blackened toast. You thought the worst part of winter might be the freezing cold, but you quickly discover it's not just the cold that makes life unbearable. It's the constant grime that coats everything. Your skin is covered in a layer of dirt, so thick you can practically feel it hardening into a second layer of armor. It's not exactly the glow of beauty you were hoping for when you woke up this morning, but you've got work to do, so you square your shoulders, lift your chin, and try to ignore the fact that every time you exhale, you're basically spraying coal dust into the very air you're trying to breathe. But oh, the sights you see. The men who stumble by, desperate to get out of the cold, their collars pulled up as if they think they're suddenly invisible. You give them a glance that says, "I'm here, but are you here?" It's a game, this street corner hustle, a game that doesn't care how frozen your fingers are. Sometimes it's more about your determination to outlast the cold than about anything else. You can't help but feel like a frozen warrior in a never-ending battle with the elements, where the real victor is whoever can stand still long enough to survive the frostbite. As you stand there, watching the world go by like a slow-moving nightmare, you have to admit that the whole thing is just absurd. Imagine looking back at this moment in history and wondering how you ever survived. How did people live like this, and what were they wearing to survive it? You start to wonder if maybe a woolen shawl was the secret, but then the wind whips it from your shoulders like it's laughing in your face. Was there ever anything comfortable about Victorian London, or did it all just exist to break you down, bit by bit, until you were nothing but a walking bundle of icy, dirty bones? The truth is, the streets of Victorian London don't care. The wind doesn't care. The mud doesn't care. The only thing that does care is your next step, your next moment of survival. Because no matter how miserable it gets, you keep going. You hustle. You make it work. Somehow, in a city where winter seems designed to kill you, you persist. So as you trudge forward, trying to keep your feet beneath you in the muck, just know that you're not alone in this. Everyone around you is fighting their own battle against the cold, the dirt, and the insanity of it all. It's a strange thing to find solidarity in suffering, but here in the heart of the worst neighborhood in London, it's what keeps you going. And really, isn't that the best any of us can hope for? That we find a way to keep moving, even when the world seems to be against us. All right, so you're probably thinking you could tough it out in your new winter outfit. Just a few layers, right? Wrong. In Victorian London, layering up wasn't just about fashion, it was a matter of survival. Imagine wearing so many petticoats you could barely move, paired with a corset so tight you'd pass out from lack of air. On top of that, your woolen shawl is about as effective as a wet napkin against the freezing chill. But hey, at least the cold kept the rats at bay, right? Or did they just find their way into your bonnet? To understand the absurdity of this, you've got to picture yourself in the thick of it, multiple layers of wool, cotton, and flannel, all clinging to your body in a desperate attempt to shield you from the brutal cold. You'd think these garments were designed by someone who'd never seen a cold winter in their life. The layers are so heavy that it feels like you've become a walking quilt. You have to waddle just to move, each step feeling like you're dragging around a set of heavy blankets, while simultaneously suffocating in your corset. And let's not even talk about how you can't breathe properly. It's like trying to function with a boa constrictor on your chest, except that it's not just any boa constrictor. It's the literal embodiment of Victorian beauty standards. The corset, of course, is the pièce de résistance. Imagine a tight, suffocating embrace that cuts off your ability to breathe properly. You're literally one wrong move away from passing out. And the worst part? This isn't just a fashion statement. It's required. You're practically expected to have a waist that could rival the width of a small tree branch. The idea is to create a silhouette that says, I am refined, delicate, and definitely not just trying to stay alive in this freezing hellscape. But in reality, you're just trying to get through the day without turning into a human icicle. At least when you faint, it's probably because of the corset, not the cold. So there's that. Now, let's talk about your shawl. You've got one wrapped around your shoulders, but it's made of wool so thin it might as well be a tissue. It's like wearing a paper towel against a blizzard. You might as well be trying to shield yourself with a napkin at a Thanksgiving dinner. But hey, it's the best you've got, so you huddle deeper into it, praying for warmth that will never come. The chill seeps through every layer, reaching into your bones like a personal vendetta. That shawl is your most loyal companion, even though it provides the same level of protection as a celebrity wearing sunglasses at night. And just when you think things can't get worse, they do. You feel something move in your bonnet. You stop, blinking in confusion. Oh no, it's a rat. It has found its way into your headwear, presumably because it realized the city is full of fresh food in the form of, well, you. Imagine having to endure not only the endless cold, but also the constant battle to keep creatures out of your hair. At this point, the rats are probably just a part of the team, like a secret weapon in the game of survival. They're probably more comfortable than you are. They've certainly found more warmth than you, considering they get to nestle inside your clothing while you trudge along in the frozen streets. But let's be real, you've already reached the point where the idea of wearing rats as a fashion accessory seems reasonable. While you struggle to adjust the layers, all you can think is, why couldn't they have invented a good coat? Instead, you're stuck in a woolen nightmare that would make any modern fashionista clutch their pearls and run in the other direction. It's cold, it's uncomfortable, and nothing, absolutely nothing, is designed to make you feel remotely at ease. Even your gloves are so thin and brittle, they feel more like decorations than anything functional. Sure, they look great in theory, but the second your fingers touch anything outside, it's like being slapped in the face by Jack Frost's icy hand. But here's the kicker. You've got to keep moving. You can't stop, even though everything is conspiring against you. You trudge through the streets, layered up in your ridiculous ensemble, hoping that somewhere, somehow, you'll find some warmth. At least you have company. Every other soul on the street is wrapped in layers, just as ridiculous as yours, all suffering in unison like some sort of bizarre fashion parade. If there was ever a time to appreciate modern clothing that doesn't suffocate you and doesn't invite rats into your hair, this is it. So as you shuffle down the street, one eye on your layers and the other on the sky, you start to realize something important. Surviving the winter in Victorian London wasn't about looking good. It was about enduring the unimaginable. You don't get to be fashionable when your main goal is simply staying alive. In the end, it's all about survival. And the best part, you're doing it. The rats may be cozy, the shawl may be useless, and that corset might be cutting off all your circulation, but somehow you're managing to move forward in a world that clearly doesn't care whether you make it through. If that's not a victory, I don't know what is. Your office for the night, a cold, foggy street corner. The wind cuts through you like a blade, your breath visible in the air like little puffs of rebellion. The only warmth you get comes from the nearby gas lamps, their flickering light offering little comfort in this dark, cruel world. You can hear the shuffle of feet in the distance, but you're too busy praying for someone, anyone, to approach you for your services. How do you survive night after night in this kind of brutal environment? And what were these Victorian street corners really like? What could you even sell for a few shillings when all you had was your worn-out boots and a thin shawl? In the thick fog of the night, you can barely make out the outlines of other souls stumbling past, faces obscured by the mist, hands shoved deep into threadbare pockets, heads down against the cold. But you know better than to try and hide from it. The streets in this city aren't forgiving, and neither is the life you've been forced into. You're not just out here for the fresh air and candlelit romance. No, you're here to make ends meet, to survive the hellish nights on these cruel streets where comfort is a concept from a faraway dream. The gas lamps dot the street like some sort of cruel joke, tiny pockets of flickering warmth in an otherwise freezing world. They're practically useless when it comes to giving off heat, but you appreciate their faint glow because it's all that stands between you and the abyss. The night's shadows stretch like hungry beasts, waiting for someone to make a mistake. Anyone walking alone, lost in the fog, is a target. And there you are, was standing at the corner like a beacon of vulnerability, hoping for some sense of direction, or more realistically, a customer who's equally desperate for warmth. As you stand there, barely able to feel your fingers through the thin fabric of your gloves, you try not to think about the possibility of becoming invisible to everyone around you. What must it be like to be seen in this freezing hellscape? The idea of warmth is like a cruel mirage, an illusion you know you can't touch. Instead, you're left waiting, bundled up in layers so thick they restrict your movement, yet still feel like they're nothing against the biting chill. You try to keep your posture straight. There's something about standing tall, no matter the exhaustion, that makes you feel like you still have a little dignity left. But it doesn't last. When your feet start to ache and the freezing dampness sinks into your bones, you begin to realize that standing tall in these conditions is as much an act of defiance as it is of survival. Every time someone walks by without stopping, a small part of you dies inside. You wonder how much longer you can stand here, exposed to the elements, waiting for a glimpse of salvation. But then, you remember, this is your job. And while it might seem like the worst place in the world to be, there are 100 others just like you, standing on their own corners, hoping for a break. A shilling here, a shilling there, enough to feed yourself maybe. Or perhaps, just enough to buy another layer of clothing that'll only give you a few more moments of warmth before it wears through. And yet, despite everything, there's a certain rhythm to this life. The night drags on, one agonizing hour after another. But every so often, someone approaches. You don't even need to know their face. The shuffle of their footsteps is enough. They're just like you, worn down, tired, cold. But tonight, they've come to pay for the warmth they can't find anywhere else. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. A few minutes of connection in a world where warmth is both rare and precious. Is that too much to ask for? So, you steel yourself, your breath coming in short puffs, the mist thick around you. Your back aches, but it's nothing compared to the ache in your stomach. You have a job to do, after all. The world may be a freezing, fog-shrouded nightmare, but at least in this cold, there's still a chance for something, even if it's just for one fleeting moment of escape. But let's be honest, if you had the chance, you'd trade every single shilling for just a single moment of comfort. A warm fire, a soft blanket, a life that isn't this cold. You wonder, as the next man walks by, what it would feel like to be someone else, someone who doesn't have to sell their body to survive, someone who doesn't get lost in the fog of desperation night after night. But you can't afford to dream. Not yet. There's work to be done. In this harsh world of fog, gaslights, and icy wind, survival is more than a goal. It's a game, and you're playing it with everything you've got, no matter how small the victory may be. Picture this. It's so cold, your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth. You can feel the frostbite nibbling at your toes through your worn shoes, and the chill in the air could freeze the very marrow in your bones. And yet, here you are, standing under a dim street lamp, waiting for a customer with nothing to protect you but a thin layer of fabric that might as well be paper. How did anyone survive these brutal winters? And did the idea of comfort even exist back then? Spoiler alert, it didn't. Not really. It's hard to imagine just how relentless the cold must have been in Victorian London. The streets, the slick with ice and mud, become a trap, each step like walking on sharp shards of glass as the air itself seems to bite at your skin. You've got your layers. Yes, layers, but none of them really do the job. A woolen shawl might keep your shoulders slightly less exposed, but it offers little defense against the sharp, unrelenting chill that cuts through every seam of your worn-out dress. The thin fabric of your shawl is about as effective as using a tissue to block a blizzard. You wrap it tighter, hoping it will somehow miraculously provide some warmth, but it's like trying to hold a snowstorm in your hands. The cold doesn't care how tightly you try to hug it out of existence. Meanwhile, your shoes, if you can even call them shoes, do their best impression of paper bags trying to pretend they're boots. Each step sends a shockwave of cold through your feet, the frost creeping through the holes in the soles and up into your bones. But what's the alternative? Bare feet? You laugh bitterly at the thought. The last thing you need is to risk losing a toe to frostbite, but it doesn't feel like there's much of a choice. Either way, you're getting hurt by the cold, so you stand there, shivering, feeling the burn of frostbite as you try not to think about how much worse it could get. At least the frozen numbness in your toes makes it easier to stand still without feeling your aching feet. Small mercies, right? And yet, the worst part isn't the chill that wraps around you like an invisible predator. It's the sheer lack of comfort. The idea of comfort in Victorian England was an absurdity, a joke told in hushed tones while people huddled together for warmth. There are no soft blankets, no fluffy pillows waiting for you at the end of the day. Instead, you'd be lucky to find a place to curl up for a few hours of sleep without the constant threat of rats, disease, or worse. The warmth you crave, the warmth of something as simple as a blanket or a heated room, is an impossibility in your world. Every night you're out there, exposed, desperate for the comfort of a fire that might take the edge off, but that too is just a fleeting dream. But that doesn't mean you give up. You can't afford to. You stand there in the dark, the cold gnawing at your body, but your mind is still sharp, still alert. You've been doing this long enough to know that survival isn't just about fighting the elements. It's about holding on through them, inch by inch, day by day. It's not the cold that breaks you, but the desperation, the feeling of being invisible, of being reduced to nothing more than a body's standing in the night. The cold might make you numb, but it's the loneliness that can freeze your spirit. The worst thing about winter in Victorian London was the relentless, all-consuming sense that you were nothing more than a cog in a broken machine. The very streets you walk on are soaked with the sweat and misery of countless others, struggling just as you are to survive another day. How did they survive, you wonder? And did they ever dream of warmth? Or was it enough to simply stay alive? The gas lamps flicker, their dim light offering little more than a brief illusion of warmth. The air is thick with fog, as though the city itself is suffocating in its own cold breath. But you don't have the luxury of surrendering to the hopelessness of it all. You're here for a reason: to survive, to scrape by, to keep moving forward even when every part of you wants to collapse under the weight of it. And as miserable as it is, there's a strange kind of resolve that forms within you, a quiet stubbornness that refuses to give in to the cold. There's no real warmth in your world, not in the way you would like it. The warmth you have is the fleeting touch of a stranger, the occasional flicker of the gas lamps, the promise of a hot drink when you finally find a place to shelter. But even then, it's barely enough to stave off the cold. The comfort of modern heaters and soft blankets is something you'll never know in this life. So in the end, you learn to accept the cold as part of who you are. It's not just a physical chill, it's a part of your resilience, the mark of someone who's weathered more than the elements and kept going despite it. In this world, comfort is a luxury, a myth, and survival is the only truth. Every step you take feels like a gamble. Will you land in a puddle of freezing mud or a pile of animal waste? Probably both. You try to navigate the slushy streets, but it's like trying to walk on a giant slip and slide that's been abandoned since the last rainstorm. It's enough to make you want to scream, but you're too busy trying to avoid a potential face-first collision with the pavement. You might think the cold is the worst of it, but wait until you encounter the mud. Let's set the scene. Victorian London is a cesspool of dirt, filth, and an unrelenting amount of muck that seems determined to ruin every part of your day. The streets, once cobbled and dignified, have turned into swampy nightmares. The weather, which can never decide if it's trying to freeze you or drown you in rain, leaves the roads in a constant state of soggy chaos. As you step out onto the street, you feel the squelch of thick, freezing mud sucking at your worn boots. Every step is a struggle. Your foot sinks slightly into the earth, as if it's trying to drag you down into a cold, grimy grave. And what's worse, every step you take only seems to make it worse. You're not walking. You're trudging through a landscape of muck that will be your constant companion until the end of your shift. You might think the cold is bad, but the mud? Oh, the mud is the real villain here. It's not just inconvenient. It's a soul-crushing force of nature. Imagine trying to keep your balance while wearing shoes that were barely acceptable to begin with. They're practically falling apart under the strain of each sludgy step. But hey, they're better than bare feet, right? Your shoes squish. You make an unholy sound with every step and seem to cling to the mud like they're in some desperate, twisted union. If you had any dignity left, the mud would have stomped it out of you by now. But it doesn't stop there. That precious dignity you're clinging to, it's now covered in filth, and you can't help but wonder if it's just an inevitability in Victorian London. Getting covered in muck is part of the survival package. As you fight against the mud, each new obstacle only makes the situation worse. A cart trundles by, its wheels splashing a wave of filthy water in your direction. You flinch, but it's too late. You're already soaked, from your boots all the way up to your skirts. The water's frigid, but it's not even the worst part. No, the worst part is the realization that you're probably going to be walking around in wet shopping clothes for hours. And it doesn't matter if you're in the middle of a conversation with someone or running an errand for the day, people will notice. They'll see your soaked hemline and know that you've crossed the line between civilized and muddy. You'll be stuck with it, wearing the city's grime like a badge of dishonor. But it's not just the embarrassment that gets to you. It's the sheer stubbornness of the mud. It's relentless, and it's everywhere. There's no escaping it. As you attempt to find the driest patch of pavement, which, spoiler alert, doesn't exist, you begin to realize that every step forward only leads to more mud. It's like being stuck in a bad dream, but without the ability to wake up. It's not as though you have the luxury of simply avoiding it either. The streets are so narrow and crowded that you're forced to fight your way through, like some sort of tragic, muddy gladiator. The woman beside you stumbles and falls, her skirt dragging through the slush, and you can't help but wonder if it's only a matter of time before you too faceplant into the muck. And it's not just the physical toll. The mental exhaustion of it all is enough to wear you down. The thought of the mud gets into your bones and makes you feel like you're constantly fighting an enemy that refuses to be defeated. You know you can't avoid it, and you certainly can't outrun it. You might as well resign yourself to the fact that, like everyone else in this city, you'll spend the rest of the day wading through a swamp of despair. As you trudge on, the thought of home seems more like a fantasy than a possibility. It doesn't matter how many times you tell yourself you'll be warm soon or that the day is almost over. You know you're not truly going to escape until the mud has finally worked its way into every inch of your life. There's no escaping it, no avoiding it. It's not just a part of life, it is life. So you keep walking, one cold, miserable, muddy steps after another, and somehow, in the mess of it all, you survive. It's hard to say whether the mud ever becomes something you accept, or if you just learn to live with it. Either way, the streets are always waiting for you, ready to drag you back into their cold, filthy embrace. The city is as grimy as it is relentless, and its mud is just another reminder that in Victorian London, comfort is a far-off dream, something you'll never find unless you can afford a place where the streets stay clean and dry. Spoiler alert, you can't. And so, you wait on. You know what's not getting any better in the freezing cold? Hygiene. In fact, it's probably getting worse. You could bathe in the Thames River, or you could avoid it altogether, since that's where everyone else's waste is dumped. You think you're grossed out by the filth on your skin? Imagine the absolute horror of trying to freshen up in the 19th century. Ever tried to wash yourself in water that's colder than your ex's heart? Yeah, good luck with that. Let's talk about washing up in Victorian London. The idea of a hot shower? Not in this lifetime. No, you've got to make do with whatever cold, grimy water you can find. You might think a washcloth would do the trick, but the reality is that scrubbing your face with freezing water only results in a face that's still dirty, just red and a little more numb. If you're lucky enough to have a basin, consider yourself blessed, because in most cases, you're left trying to scrub your skin in a river of sludge. Imagine standing there in the dead of winter, your fingers so numb from the cold that you can barely grip your soap. It's like trying to clean yourself with a block of ice, and let's not even discuss what that water might contain. Oh, wait, we have to, because that's where all the city's waste is going. That lovely Thames water you thought was going to freshen you up. It's the same water that's had a little visit from the entire city's garbage and bodily fluids. There's no escaping it. You think you can avoid it by using a public bathhouse, but good luck with that. These places were a nightmare. You're packed in with dozens of other grimy souls, all standing shoulder to shoulder in water that's colder than a snowman's handshake. The idea of privacy doesn't even enter the equation. If you're lucky, you might get a small patch of water that isn't completely overcrowded with people and their various aromas. If you're unlucky, you're stuck in a vat of human soup that smells like wet dog mixed with rancid fish. It's about as refreshing as being buried alive in a pile of wet laundry. And let's not forget the lack of soap, because you're not exactly rolling in the luxury goods when you're working the streets. Scrubbing yourself with dirt? Now that's a Victorian bath. You might try to stay fresh in between baths, but the reality is, you're probably carrying a permanent layer of grime. Think about it. You're walking through the filthy streets, constantly surrounded by the stench of horses, animal waste, and the omnipresent cloud of smoke rising from chimneys. The idea of cleanliness, especially personal hygiene, is a joke, because unless you're a wealthy member of society, you're not getting anywhere near a clean spot for more than 5 minutes. You might rub your face with a handkerchief, but all that does is smear the dirt around. If you're lucky, you'll find a public fountain to splash your face with a little water, but it's not exactly a spa day, is it? And let's talk about your hair. Ever tried to keep your hair looking decent when every gust of wind is blowing coal dust into your face, and your only option for washing it is dipping it in freezing cold water? By the time you're done washing, your hair is more matted than a cat's fur ball. If you're lucky, you'll find a comb, but it won't help much when your hair has become a tangled mess of dirt, oil, and whatever else has been thrown at you by the streets. So you just give up. Your hair becomes a helmet of grease, your face a battleground of grime, and the whole concept of cleanliness gets tossed out the window as you trudge along, just trying to get through another day. Now let's talk about the little problem of odor. It's not like you have any control over it. You're walking around in layers of clothes that have soaked up every scent of the streets. Wet dog, human sweat, horse manure, and the faint smell of burning coal. Every time you walk by someone, they don't just see you, they smell you, and you smell like the world's most rancid mixture of misery and dirt. But who can blame you? You haven't had a proper bath in who knows how long. At least you're not alone in this stinky mess. Everyone else around you is in the same situation, so the air is filled with a shared sense of, I can't escape this, so I'll just pretend it's fine. The stink becomes a sort of unspoken bond between you and the rest of the downtrodden masses. You can imagine what it's like for someone working the streets all night. There's no time for bathing or even keeping up with basic hygiene. The streets are your battleground, and the only thing you can focus on is survival. Even if you manage to get a few moments of rest, the dirt is so ingrained in your skin, you can feel it pressing against your muscles. It's like being trapped in a permanent layer of filth that refuses to let go. And when the cold weather hits, the mud and dirt freeze to your body, cementing the grime onto you like it's part of your soul. The concept of fresh doesn't even exist. You might try to freshen up, but all you'll do is make the dirt a little wetter and the smell a little more pungent. The entire city, it seems, has accepted that this is just how life is. Cleanliness is a luxury only a select few can afford, And the rest of you, you just keep trudging on, covered in layers of grime, waiting for the next cold snap to remind you that in Victorian London, personal hygiene is a distant dream, not a reality. In the end, you might not look or feel clean, but at least you're alive. That's the bar in this city. The dirt, the smell, the grime. It's all part of surviving the streets. And somehow you manage. You survive, because that's what you do. You keep going, no matter how dirty the world gets. After a long night of freezing on the street, your stomach growls so loud it could wake the dead. But what's on the menu? A bit of stale bread, maybe some cheese if you're lucky. Victorian London's diet for the lower class was about as appetizing as a sock and far less filling. You thought it was hard to decide what to eat for dinner in 2023. Imagine trying to survive on whatever you could scrounge up, all while fighting off the chill of the night. Don't forget your scurvy. You might not survive the winter without it. Your first option is always bread, because bread is the backbone of the Victorian lower class diet, and not in a glamorous way. No, this is hard, stale, moldy bread, usually left over from the day before and often slightly too hard to eat without risking a dental emergency. It's the kind of bread that could double as a weapon, at least if it wasn't so bland. You might be tempted to dip it in water or a bit of watery soup if you're lucky, but let's be honest, that's still just bread with extra sogginess. You might think there's something comforting about bread, but when you've been living off it for days, it starts to feel more like an obligation than a treat. But of course, there's no guarantee you'll even get that much. Often, you find yourself scavenging whatever scraps you can get your hands on. If there's any leftover meat or scraps from someone who could afford it, well, good luck. The reality is that the meat you'll get isn't from the juiciest cuts. You're not dining on roast beef or chicken legs. You're getting the bits that no one else wanted, fat, gristle, and bone. And sure, you try to gnaw on it like a desperate animal, but when the meat is as tough as Victorian attitudes toward the poor, it's not exactly a fulfilling meal. If you're lucky, you might find a small piece of cheese tucked away. It's probably smelly, and likely the kind that's been sitting around long enough to be more of a science experiment than a food item. But again, you take what you can get. You bite into it with as much hope as you can muster, trying to convince yourself that cheese, no matter how rank, is at least a step up from bread. But really, it's a race to see what will spoil first, the bread, the cheese, or your will to keep going. Your stomach rumbles, and you try not to think about how your body is eating itself just to survive. And let's not forget about the great dietary joy that is pottage. In theory, it sounds like a lovely, warm, hearty dish, some sort of vegetable stew that will nourish your body after a hard day's work. But in reality, pottage is more like the great cosmic joke of the Victorian era. A bowl of watery, bland mush, most often made from whatever vegetable scraps were thrown together in an unholy union of leftovers. There's no meat to speak of, no flavor, just soggy, miserable cabbage or turnips, maybe a little onion, all boiled together into a sad, gray concoction. This isn't the kind of soup that brings joy to your soul. It's the kind of soup that makes you wonder if you might have just eaten a pile of dirt with a hint of despair. And then, of course, there's the joy of scurvy, because why not add a little vitamin deficiency to your misery? In a world where fresh fruits and vegetables were a rare luxury, when scurvy was a constant companion to the poor. Your gums start to swell, Your joints ache, and you wonder why your skin has taken on a suspiciously pale tint. The worst part? You can't just stop eating bread and cheese and expect a miracle. You'd have to somehow get your hands on fresh fruit, something rich in vitamin C, but who can afford that? People with money, sure. But you? You're lucky if you found enough coins to buy a half-burned piece of meat from a street vendor. Fresh fruit might as well be a foreign concept, like the idea of vacations or personal space. It's not just that your food is unappetizing, it's actively working against you. The limited nutrition you get from your meals just isn't enough to keep you going. You might think it's hard to function on a modern diet of overly processed snacks and reheated leftovers, but imagine living on scraps that barely even register as food. It's a constant battle to keep your body from breaking down as your energy wanes and your health deteriorates. There's no joy in food, only survival. And even then, you wonder how long that survival can last when every meal feels like you're just putting a band-aid on a bullet wound. But you keep going. You get up the next morning and you walk those freezing streets, your stomach still growling and your body still weak from hunger. It doesn't matter that your stomach's gnawing at you like a hungry beast. It's just another day. You might not have the luxury of a good meal or even a hot drink, but somehow you survive. Every piece of stale bread, every scrap of cheese, every pitiful serving of pottage keeps you moving forward, even if only one miserable step at a time. So, as you stand there, trying to ignore your empty stomach, you can't help but wonder, how did anyone survive this life? The cold, the hunger, the never-ending cycle of scraping by. It's a miracle that anyone made it through the winters in Victorian London. And yet they did. They kept going. And in the end, that's the only thing that really matters. There's a reason these women are called tough. Not only are they battling the cold, the mud, the hunger, and the occasional rat infestation, but they're also dealing with the constant threat of violence. You might think you're tough for getting through a long workday or surviving a tough workout, but these women survived an unrelenting, hostile world with their only weapon, sheer grit. Can you even begin to imagine? Probably not. But let's dive into how they did it anyway. Imagine stepping out into a world where every single day is a fight for survival, not just against nature, but against other people who see you as nothing more than an object. For these women, the very streets they walked on were battlegrounds, and their only defense wasn't armor or weapons. It was the sheer force of their will to keep going, no matter what. You're already tired just thinking about it, right? But here's the thing. These women didn't have the luxury of being tired. They were out there, in the cold, in the mud, doing what they had to do just to scrape by. Their bodies were their only means of survival, and every step forward was a small victory against the forces trying to break them down. The streets didn't care if they were tired, hungry, or sick. The world didn't pause for a moment of weakness, so they kept moving. They had to. And let's not forget about the cold. It was more than just uncomfortable. It was a constant threat. There were no blankets waiting for them at the end of the day, no hot cup of tea to soothe their aching bones. Instead, it was layers of thin, inadequate clothing, often wet and soaked through from the never-ending rain. The freezing air gnawed at their skin like 1,000 tiny daggers. But they kept going, the cold biting at their fingers and faces, their breath turning to ice in the air. A lot of people might have given up in that situation, but these women just pushed forward, one frozen step at a time. The cold wasn't a hurdle, it was a constant companion, and they learned to live with it, if not embrace it. Then there was the mud. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was like nature itself was conspiring against them. Every step on the slick, slippery streets was a gamble. Would they slip? Would they get stuck? Or worse, would they end up covered head to toe in the grime of the city? It was a battle to stay on their feet, but there was no alternative. They couldn't just stop walking because the streets were dangerous. If anything, the mud only made them tougher. Every step was a reminder that they were still standing, still fighting, and somehow that made it all a little bit easier to bear. Now let's talk about the rats. Because yes, rats were part of the deal. They weren't just some occasional nuisance. They were an ever-present part of the landscape, swarming in the filth and shadows of the streets. Imagine having to sleep in a room full of rats. You could hear them skittering across the floor, hear their teeth gnawing on whatever they could find. But even the rats couldn't stop these women from doing what they needed to do. They had to keep going. If they didn't, they knew they'd be left behind. They couldn't afford to be weak, and so they learned to ignore the rats, to tune out the scurrying, the squeaking, and just focus on surviving. The presence of the rats, gross as it was, became a part of their world, something they had to endure to get through another day. But perhaps the hardest part, the one that truly tested their resilience, was the constant threat of violence. Whether it was from men who saw them as disposable, or from other women fighting for the same scraps, the risk of injury or worse was ever present. It wasn't just a matter of physical survival, it was emotional survival too. These women had to carry the weight of knowing that at any moment, someone might try to take from them what little they had. And yet, they carried on, because they knew that giving up was never an option. They might not have had a weapon to fight back, but they had their minds, their cunning, and their sheer willpower. In a world where weakness was punished, the strength came in many forms. Sometimes it was the ability to outsmart the threat. Other times, it was simply the ability to keep standing when everything in the world was trying to knock you down. You might think you'd break under that kind of pressure, but somehow they didn't. They kept going, not because it was easy, but because they had no other choice. Each day was a battle, and they fought it with everything they had. They fought with their bodies, their minds, and their unbreakable will to survive. And even though their lives were filled with suffering and hardship, they endured, because that's what it meant to be tough in Victorian London, to keep moving forward, no matter how impossible the world made it seem. So next time you think about quitting, about giving up because the world feels too heavy, think of them, the women who lived through a world so hostile, so unforgiving, and still found a way to survive. Their resilience wasn't born out of luxury, it was born out of necessity, and that's something you can never forget. When night falls and the city becomes a jungle of shadows, those flickering gas lamps are your only friends. But don't be fooled. The light they provide is barely enough to see the grime on your shoes, let alone keep you warm. It's like standing under the world's most depressing nightlight. So how did these women find any comfort at all in the cold, dark streets of Victorian London? Well, they didn't. But that didn't stop them from soldiering on. Picture it. The streets of London bathed in an eerie, ghostly glow, thanks to the gas lamps that line the roads. These lamps, a marvel of the era, were supposed to illuminate the night, but what they really do is create more shadows than light. It's almost as if they're there just to remind you how utterly alone you are in the city. Their flickering light does nothing to push back the darkness. Instead, it only serves to cast a sickly glow over the streets, making everything feel more dangerous and distant. You could stand under one of these lamps and feel less seen, not more, like you're a specter in a world that barely notices you. These gas lamps were meant to offer a sense of safety and comfort, but let's be honest, they were no more than a cruel illusion. They didn't ward off the cold, they barely lit your way. On a cold winter's night, they offered little more than a faint glimmer of hope, which is about as effective as a candle in a blizzard. The moment you step out from their soft light, you're swallowed by the inky blackness of the city, and that's when you really start to feel the weight of it all. The streets are empty, the cold is bone deep, and you have nothing to hold on to except that fleeting, flickering light. It's like a tiny flicker of hope that's always just out of reach, burning out before it can warm you. Imagine standing there, your breath puffing out in small, visible clouds of despair, waiting for someone, anyone, to approach you. And while you're waiting, that gas lamp is your only comfort. But even that comfort is deceptive. The warmth it promises never materializes. Instead, it serves as a reminder that the world outside of it is dark, cold, and unforgiving. It's like standing under a nightlight in a room full of monsters. The only thing you can do is keep your head down and keep moving, hoping the next corner brings something better, even though you already know it won't. These women knew the street lamps weren't going to save them, but they had no choice but to rely on them. It wasn't just the light they were after. It was the faintest sense of connection to a world that seemed to forget about them the moment the sun dipped below the horizon. But the light was as fickle as the men they were waiting for, and just like that, you're left standing in the cold again, with only the memory of warmth to keep you going. In between the flickering lamps, the street becomes a wild, chaotic blur. It's easy to feel invisible when you're lost in the shadows, and these women were far too familiar with that feeling. The gas lamps cast just enough light to show the grim reality of their lives. The dirt on their clothes, the thinness of their shoes, the worn edges of their shawls, everything becomes illuminated in that dim, sad glow. But none of it brings warmth. It doesn't protect them from the cold, and it certainly doesn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. There's no sense of comfort, no sense of peace, just a fleeting moment of visibility in a world that seems determined to obscure them at every turn. But what else could they do? They couldn't afford to stand still and wait for better days. They had to make do with what they had, and sometimes that meant relying on a tiny circle of light in an otherwise dark world. Those gas lamps were a cruel reminder that while the world was bleak, it was the only world they had, and they would have to survive in it. The light didn't offer warmth, it merely gave them a glimpse of what might be, a distant dream of comfort they knew they couldn't have. Yet it wasn't the lamps themselves that kept these women going. It was the fact that they could stand there despite everything. They could survive the cold, the filth, and the isolation because they had to. And maybe, just maybe, that tiny bit of light was enough to remind them they weren't entirely alone. In the end, the gas lamps didn't make life easier, and they certainly didn't make the world kinder. But they gave these women something vital, a reason to keep going, even when everything seemed designed to drag them down. They weren't just surviving, they were enduring, with a strength that was as flickering and stubborn as the lamps themselves. And sometimes, That's all you need to make it through another night. You know that cozy feeling you get when you're bundled up in your favorite hoodie, sipping on hot cocoa? Imagine the opposite of that. Imagine frostbite, hypothermia, and the gnawing feeling of illness constantly creeping in. Winter in Victorian London was a health nightmare, but you still had to keep going. Every day, no rest for the weary. How did people even cope with the constant threat of disease, frostbite, and death creeping around every corner? Spoiler, they didn't always survive, but they sure kept trying. The winter months in Victorian London were brutal, not just for the poor, but for anyone caught in the freezing grip of the city's unforgiving weather. And the reality was, there were no modern heaters, no insulated jackets, and certainly no fancy heated seats on the tube. What you had were layers upon layers of clothing that barely kept the cold at bay, shoes that couldn't protect your feet from the ice, and that ever-present threat of frostbite nipping at your toes and fingers. Picture your hands frozen stiff, your feet aching with the sharp, biting pain of cold creeping up your legs, and your nose red and raw from the wind. You thought the cold could be brutal, but this was a daily battle against the elements, with your body always on the verge of giving in. And it wasn't just the cold, it was the constant dampness that soaked through every layer of clothing, every pair of shoes. The streets of London weren't just cold, they were wet. Mud, slush, and stagnant water made walking a miserable experience, especially when every step threatened to drown your already soaked shoes in another freezing puddle. The moisture worked its way into your skin, chilling you to the bone and making the cold feel even worse. It's no wonder the poor had a difficult time just staying alive, let alone thriving. Their lives were a series of small battles against frostbite, pneumonia, and other diseases that thrived in the damp, cold conditions. Frostbite was a constant threat. It didn't matter if you were a worker on the docks, a prostitute standing on the street corner, or just a regular person trying to survive the harsh conditions. If you weren't careful, your extremities would start to turn pale, cold, and numb, and before you knew it, you'd be battling an infection, or worse, losing a toe or finger to the freeze. The cold didn't just sting, it could take a part of you, quite literally. These women had to keep their hands and feet wrapped up as best they could, but there was never enough protection. When the wind picked up, when the temperatures dropped, you could feel your body start to betray you, inch by inch. But even if frostbite didn't get you, the damp and cold would. Hypothermia was just as much a danger as frostbite, though it crept up more slowly, wrapping its fingers around your body until you were shivering uncontrollably, unable to function properly. Imagine standing there, numb from the cold, or your teeth chattering, your legs feeling like they might give way beneath you, and knowing you had no choice but to keep working, to keep standing in that icy hell, just to make a few shillings. Rest wasn't an option. You had to push through the pain, through the weakness, so through the cold that made every bone in your body scream for relief. Then there was the constant threat of illness. The poor didn't just face cold and frostbite. They lived in a petri dish of disease. The streets were lined with filth, sewage ran unchecked through open gutters, and disease spread like wildfire. The poor were often malnourished, their immune systems weakened from a steady diet of starches and little else, leaving them vulnerable to everything from cholera to tuberculosis. Imagine trying to stand out on the streets while your body is fighting off an illness that you can't even treat. When you get sick, There's no warm bed, no doctor to call, no medicine to ease your suffering. You're left to ride out the fever, the cough, the ache, with nothing but sheer will to get you through. And it didn't stop there. The women of Victorian London weren't just battling the elements and illness, they were battling the expectations of society. Every day they woke up to face a world that didn't care whether they lived or died. They stood in the cold, in the mud, in the grime, enduring what seemed like an endless cycle of pain and suffering. And yet somehow they kept going. Even in the face of illness, frostbite, and the ever-present threat of death, they found a way to keep surviving. How did they do it? It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was pure, unrelenting grit. It was the determination to survive in a world that seemed hell-bent on grinding them down. It was the knowledge that if they didn't push through, if they didn't keep going, they wouldn't make it to the next day. Every step was an act of defiance, every moment of victory against the forces that tried to crush them. They didn't have the luxury of comfort or health or even basic survival, but somehow they found a way to make it through. Because, in the end, survival wasn't just about health, it was about the strength to keep going, no matter how impossible it seemed. Occasionally, there were glimmers of hope in this endless winter of suffering. A rare hot meal, a few hours of respite inside a warm pub, or a fleeting moment of kindness from a passing stranger. But these were few and far between. You didn't expect much, but the small things kept you going. And who knows, maybe just surviving another day was enough. What does it feel like when the rare moments of comfort are the only thing standing between you and giving up? On the coldest of nights, when the wind bites so hard it feels like it's tearing at your very skin, there would be that rare moment of warmth. Maybe a sympathetic tavern owner would let you sit by the fire for a bit, or perhaps someone passing by would toss you a shilling, a fleeting gesture of goodwill in an otherwise indifferent world. These moments were precious, like drops of water in a desert, but they were enough to remind you that survival wasn't about finding comfort every day. It was about holding on to those brief, shining moments when you could steal a little piece from the madness. A hot meal, if you could get one, was the stuff of legends. For most people, it was the ultimate luxury, something so rare it felt like a dream. A bowl of stew, a piece of meat, maybe even a chunk of bread that wasn't hard as a brick. When you were freezing to the bone, that little bit of sustenance was a godsend. You could feel the warmth creeping into your body as you ate, the heat spreading from your stomach out into your fingers and toes, reminding you that you were still alive, still fighting. The food didn't even have to taste good. In fact, it often didn't. But it didn't matter. It was warmth, and in a world where everything was cold, inside and out, that warmth was more precious than gold. Then there were the rare moments when you could step inside a warm pub. Imagine that, entering a place where the air smelled of roasting meat and warm bread, where the fire crackled in the hearth and the sound of laughter and music filled the room. For a few hours, the cold could be forgotten. For a few hours, you could sit by the fire, sip on a mug of ale, and feel the weight of the world slide off your shoulders, if only for a moment. These tiny respites were nothing more than illusions, really. They couldn't last forever, and the warmth would fade as soon as you stepped back outside. But in those fleeting moments, you could almost believe that life might be more than just struggle and suffering, or even the smallest acts of kindness felt like a lifeline. A soft word, a hand reached out, someone offering a bit of help in a world where most people were too focused on their own survival to notice anyone else. Maybe it was a stranger who saw you standing on the corner, cold and weary, and offered to buy you a meal or a drink. Maybe it was a kind soul who took pity on you and let you rest for a moment, offering a bed or a blanket, even if it was just for the night. These small gestures were rare, but they were enough to remind you that despite everything, there was still humanity in the world. They were enough to make you believe that even in the harshest conditions, there was some goodness left in the world. But let's not kid ourselves. These moments were fleeting. The warmth of the pub didn't last when you stepped back into the freezing streets. The hot meal was just a brief escape from the hunger that would return the next day. The kindness of a stranger was forgotten the moment they turned away. And so, you trudged on. You couldn't afford to dwell on those rare moments of comfort, because if you did, you'd be crushed by the weight of their impermanence. Life was harsh, and the reality of survival was that you couldn't expect anything. You couldn't count on anything, except for your own ability to endure. And yet, it was these moments, these tiny, fleeting glimpses of hope, that kept you going. They gave you something to hold on to in the midst of a world that seemed to be constantly trying to break you. They reminded you that survival wasn't just about enduring the cold and hunger and the pain. It was about finding the will to keep going, no matter how hard the world pushed back. In the end, maybe that was all survival really was. The ability to find strength in the small things, to hold on to the hope that even in the darkest of winters, the rare moments of warmth and kindness could be enough to get you through. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to survive another day. So tonight, as you tuck into your clean bed with hot water and indoor plumbing, maybe whisper a quiet thank you to your ancestors who survived lice, leeches, and soup that might kill you. Because let's face it, surviving winter in Victorian London was no small feat. It was a daily struggle of cold, hunger, and isolation, with the constant threat of disease and violence nipping at their heels. And yet, despite all the odds, these women kept going. They survived, not because life was kind to them, but because they refused to give up. Now think about your own life. Maybe it's been tough. Maybe you've had your own share of battles, long days at work, difficult relationships, or just the weight of the world on your shoulders. But if these women could survive, in standing in the freezing cold with nothing but their sheer will to keep them going, maybe you can too. Life might not always be comfortable, but it's those moments of resilience, those small acts of survival that make it worth living. So the next time you find yourself complaining about a cold night or a bad meal, take a moment to remember those who came before you. They didn't have the luxuries we take for granted, but they found a way to endure. And maybe, just maybe, their strength is something we can all draw on when the going gets tough. As you drift off to sleep tonight, but warm and safe, remember that history isn't just about the triumphs. It's about the quiet moments of strength, the perseverance through hardship, and the resilience that can only come when the world seems to be against you. And perhaps, in some small way, you'll be reminded that no matter how harsh the world gets, there's always hope, no matter how fleeting. Good night, and may your dreams be warmer than the streets of Victorian London ever were.